Three drunk men thought they could intimidate a quiet waitress working the night shift at a small-town diner. They saw her polite smile, her careful way of moving between tables, and mistook kindness for weakness. What they didn't see was the steady hands that had never missed a target at 800 meters, the tactical awareness that catalogued every exit before she'd even clocked in, or the combat training that could neutralize 3 threats before they knew what hit them. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look the most ordinary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's Diner cast everything in. That particular shade of yellow that made even fresh food look like it had been sitting under heat lamps for hours. It was the kind of place where the coffee was always too strong. The pie cases were perpetually half empty, and the vinyl booth seats had been patched with electrical tape so many times they looked like abstract art. The clock above the register read 11:47 p.m., and Sarah Chen was counting down the minutes until her shift ended at midnight. She moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates with the kind of automatic precision that came from 6 months of doing the same routine. Her black sneakers made soft squeaking sounds against the checkered linoleum floor, a rhythm she'd grown accustomed to during the long hours when the only customers were truckers, grabbing late dinners and insomniacs seeking refuge from their own thoughts. Sarah was 28, though the fluorescent lighting added years to her face that she'd earned through different means entirely. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, secured with an elastic band that had seen better days. She wore the standard uniform required by Murphy's management: black pants, white button-down shirt, and a green apron that had Murphy's Diner home cooking since 1987, embroidered across the front in fading yellow thread. To the casual observer, she looked like exactly what she appeared to be: a woman working the graveyard shift at a roadside diner, probably putting herself through school or supporting a family, moving through her night with the quiet resignation of someone who'd accepted that this was her place in the world. Her movements were deliberate but unremarkable, her interactions with customers polite but brief, her entire presence designed to blend into the background of other people's late-night stories. But if you looked closer, if you knew what to look for, you might notice things that didn't quite fit the picture. The way her eyes automatically swept each new customer from head to toe in a single glance, cataloging height, weight, potential weapons, and exit routes. How she positioned herself so she could see both the front door and the kitchen entrance at all times. The fact that she never turned her back completely to any customer, even when pouring coffee or wiping down tables. You might notice that despite working on her feet for 8 hours straight, she moved without the tired shuffle most service workers developed. Her posture remained straight, her steps remained light, and there was something in the way she carried herself that suggested she could sprint into action at a moment's notice. But most people didn't look that closely. Most people saw the uniform and the setting and filled in the rest of the story themselves. The dinner rush, such as it was for a Tuesday night in Millfield, had ended around 10. Now the diner held its usual collection of late-night regulars. Jim Morrison, a trucker who wasn't related to the famous one, but had spent 40 years listening to jokes about it, sat at the counter working on his 3rd cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie that had definitely seen better days. Margaret Walsh, a night shift nurse from the county hospital, occupied her regular booth in the corner, using her break to grade her daughter's homework while picking at a Caesar salad. Near the window, Danny Price sat alone at a 4-top table, his laptop open and papers spread around him like he was conducting important business. In reality, he was a freelance writer who discovered that the diner's free Wi-Fi and bottomless coffee made it cheaper than his apartment for working through the night. He'd been coming in 3 nights a week for 2 months, always ordering the same thing: black coffee, wheat toast, and whatever soup hadn't been sitting in the warmer too long. These were her people, the regulars who made the late shift bearable. They were polite, predictable, and left decent tips despite not ordering much. They represented the quiet rhythm that Sarah had built her life around since moving to Millfield half a year ago. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was peaceful in a way she'd forgotten was possible. The bell above the door chimed just before midnight, and Sarah looked up from wiping down the counter to see 3 men stumbling in from the parking lot. Even from across the diner, she could smell the alcohol on them. That particular mixture of beer and whiskey that made people do stupid things they'd regret in the morning. They were loud in the way drunk people always are, talking over each other and laughing at things that probably weren't funny. The first one through the door was tall and broad-shouldered, probably around 35, wearing a flannel shirt that was too tight around his beer belly. His name was Rick Caldwell, though Sarah wouldn't learn that until later. He worked construction during the busy season and spent his winters drinking through his savings while complaining about immigrants, taking jobs he wouldn't do sober. Behind him came Tony Martinez, shorter and stockier, with hands that looked like they'd seen plenty of bar fights and arms covered in tattoos that told stories he thought made him look tough. He wore a leather jacket despite the October heat, and his boots were the kind with steel toes that could do serious damage if you knew how to use them. The third man, bringing up the rear and already looking like he might not make it through the next hour without visiting the bathroom, was Kevin Walsh, no relation to Margaret, though they'd gone to the same high school 20 years apart. Kevin had the soft look of someone who'd peaked in high school and spent the subsequent 15 years trying to recapture those glory days through increasingly pathetic attempts at reliving his youth. They chose the booth directly in the center of the dining area, sliding in with the kind of exaggerated movements drunk people make when they're trying to prove they're not as intoxicated as everyone knows they are. Their conversation was loud enough that Jim at the counter looked up from his pie with annoyance, and Margaret glanced over her reading glasses with the kind of expression nurses develop for dealing with difficult patients. Sarah finished wiping the counter, hung up her towel, and walked over to their table with a neutral smile and a patience she'd learned from dealing with far more dangerous situations than 3 drunk guys in a small-town diner. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, pulling her order pad from her apron pocket. "Can I start you off with some coffee?" Rick looked up at her with the kind of slow, obvious appraisal that made her skin crawl but didn't show on her face. His eyes traveled from her face down to her chest, lingered there longer than necessary, then continued their journey with the subtlety of a freight train. Well, he said, his words slightly slurred. "Looks like the night shift just got more interesting." His friends laughed like he'd said something clever. Tony leaned back in the booth, spreading his arms across the back of the seat in a display that was probably meant to look casual but came across as territorial. "Coffee sounds good, sweetheart," Tony said, emphasizing the endearment in a way that made it sound like an insult. "But maybe you could bring it with a little extra sugar. You look like you could use some sweetening up." More laughter from his companions. Sarah's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes for just a moment before disappearing. "Coffee it is," she said, her voice professionally pleasant. "I'll be right back with that." She turned and walked toward the coffee station, conscious of their eyes following her movement. Behind her, she heard Kevin's voice, not quite as quiet as he probably thought it was. "Nice ass on that one. Bet she'd be real friendly if we asked nice." "Or if we didn't ask at all," Rick added, and the laughter that followed had a different quality to it, something darker that made Margaret look up from her daughter's homework with concern. Sarah poured 3 cups of coffee with steady hands, each movement precise and economical. To anyone watching, she looked like she was simply doing her job, preparing an order for customers who were slightly more obnoxious than usual, but nothing she couldn't handle. They couldn't see the way she was processing threat levels, calculating distances to exits, or noting the positions of potential weapons within reach. She'd handled worse situations than this. Much worse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But those had been in places where the rules were different, where she'd had backup and superior firepower and the legal authority to neutralize threats before they became critical. Here, in this fluorescent-lit diner in small-town Ohio, the rules were different. Here, she was just Sarah Chen, night shift waitress, and these were just 3 drunk customers who hadn't technically done anything wrong yet. When she returned to their table with the coffee, Rick had moved to the outside of the booth, positioning himself so she'd have to lean across him to serve his friends. It was a classic intimidation tactic, forcing her into his personal space and making her feel trapped. What he didn't know was that Sarah Chen had never felt trapped in her life, even when she actually had been. She set the first cup down in front of Tony, then moved around the table to serve Kevin, deliberately taking the long way around to avoid giving Rick the satisfaction of making her uncomfortable. When she finally approached his side of the table, she placed his coffee down with the same professional courtesy she'd shown the others. "Have you decided what you'd like to eat?" she asked, pen poised over her order pad. "Depends what's on the menu," Rick said, and his friends laughed again. "What would you recommend, honey?" The endearment came out wrong, loaded with implications that had nothing to do with food. Sarah had heard variations of this conversation 1,000 times in a dozen different languages, from men who thought their intentions were clever and original. "The meatloaf is popular," she said evenly. "Comes with mashed potatoes and green beans. The burgers are good too, and we make our own fries." "I bet you make lots of things," Tony said, leaning forward. "Question is, what are you willing to make for the right price?" The diner had gone quiet. Jim at the counter had stopped eating his pie and was watching the interaction with growing concern. Margaret had set down her daughter's homework and was reaching for her phone. Danny had closed his laptop and was listening intently while trying to look like he wasn't. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, the way it always did when a situation began to escalate. She cataloged her options in a matter of seconds. 3 intoxicated males, probable combined weight around 600 pounds. No visible weapons, but plenty of potential improvised ones within reach. The nearest exit was 12 feet behind her. The kitchen entrance was 8 feet to her left, and she knew there was a back door through the prep area. But she also knew that running wasn't an option. Not because she was afraid, but because these weren't the kind of men who would let her leave without making their point first. And their point, she was beginning to understand, had nothing to do with food or service or anything else she could give them by doing her job. "I make whatever's on the menu," she said, her voice still level but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "If you're not interested in ordering food, maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Rick's expression changed, the drunk good humor sliding away to reveal something uglier underneath. He stood up from the booth, and Sarah immediately noted his height advantage, his weight distribution, the slight sway that indicated his level of intoxication might actually work in her favor if things went badly. "You know what I think?" Rick said, taking a step closer to her. "I think you've got an attitude problem. I think maybe somebody needs to teach you some manners." "Yeah," Tony agreed, sliding out of his side of the booth. "Some respect for paying customers." Kevin was slower to follow, his coordination clearly affected by whatever he'd been drinking, but he eventually managed to stand up as well. Now, Sarah was facing 3 men who had formed a rough semicircle around her, blocking her path to the front door but leaving the kitchen entrance still accessible. Jim Morrison had set down his coffee cup and was reaching for his phone. Margaret Walsh was already dialing 911. Danny Price was frozen in his seat, clearly wanting to help but uncertain how to intervene without making things worse. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new quality that made all three men pause without quite understanding why. "I'm going to ask you to return to your seats or leave the restaurant. You're disturbing other customers." Rick laughed, but it sounded forced now. "Or what? You'll call your manager? Get us banned from this shithole?" "Or I'll handle this myself," Sarah said quietly. There was something in the way she said it that should have been a warning. Something in her posture that should have told them they were making a serious mistake. But drunk men in groups often mistake their numbers for strength, and these three were no exception. "Handle it yourself?" Tony repeated, grinning at his friends. "How you gonna do that, sweetheart? You gonna fight all three of us?" Kevin laughed nervously. "She's probably got pepper spray or something. All these waitresses carry pepper spray." Rick took another step closer, now close enough that Sarah could smell the combination of beer and cheap cologne that clung to his flannel shirt. Close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow and the way his pupils were dilated from more than just alcohol. "Tell you what," Rick said, reaching out like he was going to touch her face. "Why don't you drop the tough girl act and be nice to us? Maybe we can work something out that makes everybody happy." His hand was inches from her cheek when Sarah moved. It wasn't dramatic or flashy like in the movies. There was no shouting or elaborate martial arts poses. One moment Rick was reaching for her face, confident in his size and numbers advantage, and the next moment he was on the floor with his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that made everyone in the diner wince. The movement had been so fast and efficient that for a second, nobody quite processed what had happened. Rick was making pained noises into the linoleum, his face pressed against the floor, while Sarah knelt beside him with one hand controlling his wrist and the other positioned at the base of his neck. "Jesus Christ!" Tony shouted, taking a step backward. "What the hell did you just do?" Kevin was staring with his mouth open, swaying slightly as his alcohol-impaired brain tried to process the sudden shift in the situation. Sarah looked up at them with calm, level eyes. "I asked you to return to your seats or leave," she said conversationally. Rick here decided to make physical contact without permission. That was a mistake. Rick tried to struggle, pushing against the floor with his free hand, but Sarah applied just enough pressure to his trapped arm to make him reconsider. The pain was immediate and effective, and he went still with a grunt. "Let him go," Tony demanded, but he made no move to help his friend. Something about the way Sarah was positioned, the casual efficiency with which she'd put Rick on the ground, had triggered a survival instinct that overrode his alcohol-fueled bravado. "I will," Sarah said reasonably. "As soon as you and Kevin sit back down and finish your coffee like civilized human beings." "You can't do this," Kevin said, his voice cracking slightly. "This is assault. We could sue you." Sarah tilted her head slightly, considering this. "Actually, Kevin, what Rick did was assault. Battery technically, since he made physical contact. What I did was self-defense. But if you'd like to call the police and discuss it with them, I'm sure they'd be very interested in hearing about." Three intoxicated men cornering a woman half their size in her workplace. As if summoned by her words, the sound of sirens became audible in the distance, growing closer. Margaret Walsh had apparently gotten through to 911, and help was on the way. "Shit," Tony muttered. "Rick, you idiot, look what you did." "I didn't do anything," Rick protested from the floor, his voice muffled and strained. "She attacked me." "After you tried to touch me without permission," Sarah corrected. "In front of multiple witnesses, while intoxicated, in a public place." The sirens were getting louder now, close enough that flashing lights were visible through the diner's windows. Tony and Kevin exchanged glances, clearly calculating whether they should run or try to brazen it out. "Look," Tony said, holding up his hands in what was probably meant to be a peaceful gesture. "This is all just a big misunderstanding. Why don't you let Rick up, and we'll forget the whole thing happened." Sarah considered this offer with the same calm expression she'd worn throughout the entire confrontation. "The police are almost here," she said. "I think we'll let them sort it out." Rick made another attempt to get up, twisting his body and trying to use his weight advantage, but Sarah's positioning was too good. Every movement he made only put more pressure on his shoulder joint, and after a few seconds he gave up with a frustrated growl. "You're crazy," he panted. "You're a crazy bitch, and I'm going to sue you for everything you've got." "That's an interesting strategy," Sarah said. "Threatening to sue the person who just prevented you from committing a crime. I'm sure the police will find that very compelling." The first patrol car pulled into the parking lot with lights flashing. But no siren, followed immediately by a second car. Through the windows, they could see uniformed officers getting out and approaching the entrance with the careful alertness of people who'd responded to enough domestic disturbances to know that things could go sideways quickly. Jim Morrison had moved from the counter to the front door, clearly intending to let the police in and explain what he'd witnessed. Margaret Walsh was still on her phone, probably talking to the 911 dispatcher. Danny Price had his laptop open. Again, but instead of working on his article, he was clearly documenting what he was seeing. The bell above the door chimed again as the first police officer entered. He was in his 40s, with gray at his temples, and the kind of measured approach that suggested he'd dealt with his share of bar fights and domestic disputes. His name tag read Officer Martinez, and he took in the scene with professional eyes. "Evening, folks," he said, his hand resting casually on his radio. "We got a call about a disturbance." "Officer Martinez," Jim Morrison said immediately. "I saw the whole thing. These three men came in drunk and started harassing the waitress. When she asked them to stop, one of them tried to grab her, and she defended herself." Martinez nodded, taking in the sight of Rick on the floor and Sarah kneeling beside him. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, "I'm going to need you to release him and step back so we can sort this out." Sarah looked up at him with the same calm expression she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "Of course, officer," she said. "But you should know that he tried to strike me when I let him up the last time." "When did you let him up before?" Martinez asked, clearly confused. "I didn't," Sarah said. "But he's going to try to hit me when I release him now. It's what men like him do when they've been embarrassed in public." Rick's face flushed red against the linoleum. "I'm not going to hit anybody. Just let me up, you psycho." Martinez stepped closer, his hand moving from his radio to his handcuffs. "Sir, I need you to stay calm and keep your voice down." "Ma'am, if you could please release him slowly." Sarah nodded and began to ease the pressure on Rick's arm. The moment he felt the restraint loosening, Rick did exactly what she'd predicted he would do. He pushed himself up with his free hand and swung wildly with his newly released arm, aiming for Sarah's face with all the coordination his alcohol-impaired system could muster. But Sarah had expected this. She was already moving, stepping inside his swing and using his momentum against him. Rick found himself face first on the floor again, this time with Officer Martinez's knee between his shoulder blades and handcuffs being applied to his wrists. "Sir, you are under arrest for assault," Martinez said, reading Rick his rights with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "You have the right to remain silent." Tony and Kevin watched their friend being arrested with expressions of growing panic. The second police officer had entered during the commotion and was now standing near them with his own hand resting on his equipment belt. "Officers," Tony said, his voice climbing higher than it had been, "we didn't do anything wrong. We just came in for coffee, and she attacked our friend for no reason." "That's not what the witnesses say," Officer Martinez replied, hauling Rick to his feet with professional efficiency. "Jim, Margaret, you want to tell me what you saw?" Both regulars were eager to provide their versions of events, and their stories corroborated each other perfectly. 3 drunk men harassing a waitress. escalating threats, physical intimidation, and an attempted assault that was thwarted by the intended victim's defensive actions. Danny Price looked up from his laptop. "I got most of it on video," he said quietly. "If that helps," Martinez nodded. "We'll want to see that." "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, "are you injured at all?" Sarah shook her head. "No, officer. I'm fine." "Do you want to press charges?" Sarah looked at Rick, who was now cuffed and considerably more sober than he'd been 10 minutes earlier. His friends were probably going to be arrested as accessories, and all three of them would spend the night in jail, followed by months of legal proceedings and community service. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." What happened next was administrative and predictable. Tony and Kevin were arrested as well, their involvement in the intimidation and their failure to intervene when their friend committed assault, making them accomplices under Ohio law. All three were loaded into police cars and transported to the county jail, where they would spend the night sobering up and contemplating their life choices. Officer Martinez took statements from all the witnesses, collected Danny's video evidence, and filled out his incident report with the thorough attention to detail that would make the prosecutor's job easier when the case went to court. But through it all, nobody asked the question that would have changed everything. Nobody wondered how a small-town waitress had moved with such precision and control. Nobody questioned how she'd known exactly where to apply pressure to subdue a man twice her size. Nobody asked why she'd predicted Rick's behavior with such accuracy. They saw what they expected to see, a woman who'd gotten lucky, who'd managed to defend herself against a drunk attacker through some combination of adrenaline and basic self-defense training. It never occurred to them that what they'd witnessed was the application of skills learned in places where mistakes got people killed. By the time the police cars pulled out of the parking lot, it was nearly 2 a.m. The diner had emptied except for Jim, Margaret, Danny, and Sarah. The regular customers were clearly shaken by what they'd witnessed, but they were also protective of Sarah in the way that regular customers become protective of service workers they've grown to like. "You okay, honey?" Margaret asked, the same endearment that had sounded threatening from Rick's mouth now carrying genuine concern. Sarah nodded, untying her apron with steady hands. "I'm fine. Thank you for calling the police. That was incredible," Danny said, closing his laptop again. "I've never seen anything like that. Where did you learn to do that?" It was an innocent question, the kind any curious person might ask after witnessing something unusual. But Sarah's answer was carefully neutral, revealing nothing. "I took some self-defense classes," she said. "Everyone should know how to protect themselves." Jim finished his pie and left a $20 tip on a bill that couldn't have been more than $8. Margaret gathered her things and squeezed Sarah's shoulder as she passed. Danny lingered, clearly wanting to ask more questions, but something in Sarah's demeanor suggested the conversation was over. By 2:30 a.m., Sarah was alone in the diner, going through her closing routine with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. She wiped down tables, refilled salt and pepper shakers, counted the till, and prepared the coffee station for the morning shift. To anyone watching, she would have looked like exactly what she appeared to be, a night shift waitress finishing up her work after an unusually eventful evening. There was nothing in her movements or demeanor to suggest that what had happened was anything other than a lucky break, a moment when training and instinct had combined to help her defend herself against 3 drunk bullies. But as she hung up her apron and collected her purse from behind the counter, Sarah Chen allowed herself a moment of genuine concern. Not about what had happened, but about what it might mean going forward. She'd been careful for 6 months to blend in, to become invisible, to live the quiet life of a small-town service worker with no history worth investigating. Tonight, she'd been forced to reveal skills that didn't match her cover story. She'd shown capabilities that would make people ask questions she couldn't answer without lying. And lies, she knew from experience, had a way of unraveling when people started pulling at loose threads. She locked up the diner and walked to her car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic, with rust spots and a dent in the passenger door that made it look like exactly the kind of car a waitress would drive. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she didn't notice the figure watching from the shadows across the street, or the way that figure reached for a phone as soon as her taillights disappeared around the corner. Sarah Chen had spent 6 months building a new life, a quiet life, a life where her past couldn't find her. But tonight, she'd been forced to use skills that would make certain people very interested in finding out who she really was. And some people, once they started looking, were very good at finding what they were searching for. The call came at 6:47 a.m., just as Sarah was falling asleep in her small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street. The ringtone was generic, nothing that would draw attention, but the number that flashed on her screen made her instantly alert. She'd memorized that number 3 years ago, along with a dozen others she'd hoped never to see again. She let it ring twice more before answering, using those seconds to center herself and prepare for whatever was coming. "Hello," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Sarah Chen." It wasn't a question. The voice belonged to Colonel Marcus Webb, though he'd probably been promoted since she'd last seen him. His tone carried the same authority it always had, the kind that expected immediate compliance and usually got it. "I think you have the wrong number," Sarah said, though they both knew she didn't mean it. "Murphy's Diner, 11:47 p.m. last night. 3 local troublemakers who picked the wrong target." "Ring any bells?" Sarah closed her eyes. She'd known this was a possibility, had calculated the risks when she'd been forced to act. But she'd hoped she had more time before her past caught up with her present. "I work at a diner," she said. "Sometimes customers get rowdy. Customers don't usually end up on the floor in joint locks that aren't taught in civilian self-defense classes." Webb's voice carried a hint of amusement now, especially not joint locks executed with the kind of precision that suggests advanced CQB training, close quarters battle. The acronym brought back memories Sarah had been trying to forget for 6 months. Sand and heat and the weight of a rifle in her hands. The controlled breathing that came before a shot that would change someone's world forever. "What do you want, Marcus?" There she is. Now the amusement was unmistakable. "I was wondering when Sergeant Chen would show up. Though I suppose it's Staff Sergeant now, isn't it? Or it would have been, if you'd stuck around for the promotion ceremony." Sarah walked to her kitchen window, looking down at Main Street. As it began to wake up, Mrs. Patterson was opening her flower shop across the way, arranging displays of autumn mums and decorative gourds. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that their quiet town had become the center of a conversation that could change everything. "I left that life behind," Sarah said. "I'm nobody special now." "Nobody special," Webb repeated. "Is that what you tell yourself?" Sarah Chen, nobody special, who just happened to neutralize 3 threats using techniques that took us 2 years to teach you properly. They were drunk idiots, not enemy combatants. True, but drunk idiots don't usually find themselves outmaneuvered by waitresses who can predict their behavior patterns and counter their movements before they know what they're doing themselves. Sarah didn't respond. There was no point in denying what Webb already knew, and admitting it would only make things worse. "We need to talk," Webb continued, "face to face." "No, it wasn't really a request, Staff Sergeant. I'm not Staff Sergeant anymore. I'm Sarah Chen, and I work at Murphy's Diner, and I don't take orders from colonels or anyone else." "Fine." Webb's voice went cold in the way Sarah remembered from briefings before particularly dangerous missions. "Then Sarah Chen, who works at Murphy's Diner, can explain to the local authorities why her fingerprints match those of a classified operative who officially doesn't exist." The threat was subtle but effective. Sarah's identity was solid, backed by documentation that would hold up under normal scrutiny. But if Webb wanted to pull strings, To have federal agencies take a closer look at the woman who'd appeared in Millfield 6 months ago with a perfect background that had never actually happened. Her carefully constructed life would crumble in a matter of hours. "Where?" she asked. "There's a state park about 20 miles north of town. Hiking trail that starts at the ranger station. Follow it for 2 miles until you see the overlook. 1 hour." The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone for a long moment, then set it down on her kitchen counter and began preparing for a conversation she'd been dreading since the day she'd decided to disappear. The state park was exactly the kind of place Webb would choose for a clandestine meeting. Remote enough for privacy, public enough to avoid suspicion, with multiple escape routes for anyone who might need them. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, parking her Honda among the handful of other vehicles belonging to early morning hikers and nature enthusiasts. She followed the trail at a steady pace, automatically cataloging her surroundings the way she'd been trained to do. 2 other hikers ahead of her, probably a married couple in their 60s, judging by their matching windbreakers and sensible shoes. A jogger coming back down the trail, headphones in, focused on his workout rather than his environment. Normal people doing normal things. The overlook provided a view of the valley below, where Millfield sat nestled among the rolling hills of southeastern Ohio. From this distance, it looked like a postcard image of small-town America, church steeples, and tree-lined streets, a high school football field, and a main street that still had more local businesses than chain stores. Webb was already there when she arrived, standing near the railing in civilian clothes that didn't quite hide his military bearing. He was older than she remembered, grayer at the temples, with new lines around his eyes that suggested the past. 3 years hadn't been easy for anyone in their former unit. "Sarah," he turned as she approached, offering a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You look different." That was the point. "Blonde doesn't suit you." Sarah had dyed her naturally black hair 6 months ago, part of the transformation. From Staff Sergeant Chen to civilian Sarah, it was one of many small changes designed to make her forgettable, unremarkable, invisible. "What do you want, Marcus? Can't we catch up first?" "It's been a while. Not long enough." Webb nodded, accepting her hostility without argument. "Fair enough. How's civilian life treating you?" "It was treating me fine until last night." "Yes, about that." Webb moved closer to the railing, looking out over the valley. "Want to tell me what really happened?" "You already know what happened. You wouldn't be here if you didn't." "I know the official version. 3 local men harassed a waitress, one of them got physical. She defended herself using what the police report describes as basic self-defense techniques. Very neat, very clean, very normal. Because that's what it was." Webb reached into his jacket and pulled out a tablet, swiping to bring up a video file. "This is security footage from across the street. Camera belongs to a pawn shop that stays open late. Angle's not great, but it shows the interior of the diner through the front windows." He held the tablet so Sarah could see the screen. The footage was grainy and shot from a distance, but it clearly showed the confrontation inside Murphy's diner. She watched herself move, saw the precise timing and economy of motion that had put Rick on the floor in seconds. "Want to explain to me how a woman who's been serving coffee for 6 months moves like someone with advanced hand-to-hand combat training?" Sarah didn't answer. They both knew the answer. "The local police didn't think to look for external security footage," Webb continued, closing the tablet. "But then, they didn't have reason to suspect their waitress was anything other than what she appeared to be. And you do?" "Sarah, 3 weeks after you disappeared, a Taliban commander named Amir Rashid was found dead in his compound outside Kabul. Single gunshot wound. Extreme range, impossible angle. The kind of shot maybe 6 people in the world could have made." Sarah's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Rashid was the target of your last official mission. The one you walked away from without completing. I told you I was done, but someone finished the job. Someone with access to classified intelligence about Rashid's location and movement patterns. Someone with the skill set to make a shot that required 3 days of reconnaissance and planning. Sarah turned away from the railing, looking back toward the parking lot where normal people were beginning normal days that didn't involve conversations about dead Taliban commanders and classified operations. Even if that were true, even if someone did complete that mission, it wouldn't have been me. I was already here, building a new life, working at Murphy's. Were you? Webb pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like travel records. Because according to these flight manifests, someone using credentials that match your biometric markers flew from Cincinnati to Dubai 3 weeks after you arrived in Millfield. Round trip. Gone for exactly 72 hours. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Sarah had hoped that particular loose end would never be discovered, that Webb's people would have better things to do than track down former operators who'd chosen to disappear. You can't prove anything, she sighed. I don't need to prove anything. I just need you to remember who you really are. I know who I am, do you? Webb stepped closer, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used during mission briefings. Because the woman I knew wouldn't be hiding. In a small town serving coffee to truckers and night shift nurses. The woman I knew was the best operator we'd ever trained. Someone who could make shots other snipers wouldn't even attempt. The woman you knew got tired of killing people. The woman I knew understood that sometimes killing people was necessary to save lives. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of memories she'd been trying to escape, faces of targets through her scope. The controlled breathing before each shot. The knowledge that every mission brought her closer to a line she wasn't sure she could cross and still remain human. Why are you here, Marcus? What do you want? Webb was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the valley where ordinary people were living ordinary lives, unaware of the extraordinary conversation taking place on a hiking trail above their town. We have a situation, he said finally. Something that requires your particular skill set. Find someone else. There is no one else, not for this. Sarah opened her eyes, studying Webb's face. In the 3 years she'd served under his command, she'd learned to read his expressions, to understand the difference between routine missions and operations that kept him awake at night. What kind of situation? The kind that involves innocent people getting hurt if we don't act quickly. The kind where precision matters more than firepower, where one perfect shot can prevent a catastrophe. I'm not interested. A terrorist cell has taken hostages in a federal building in Columbus. 17 people, including children from a school group that was touring the facility. They're demanding the release of prisoners we'll never release, and they've made it clear they're willing to execute hostages to make their point. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Call in local SWAT. Call in the FBI's hostage rescue team. We did. The building's layout makes a conventional assault nearly impossible without significant casualties. But there's a sight line from a building across the street. 1,200 meters, elevated position, multiple obstacles. Requiring precise trajectory calculation. 1,200 meters. Sarah repeated the distance automatically, her mind already calculating wind factors and bullet drop, despite her conscious desire to stay out of whatever Webb was planning. The shot has to be perfect, one chance, no margin for error. If we miss, if we wound instead of kill, if we hit the wrong target, people die. Sarah walked away from Webb, moving toward the trail that would take her back to her car, back to her apartment, back to her carefully constructed life of coffee refills and late-night customers. Find someone else, she said again. There is no one else who can make that shot. You know it, and I know it. Then those people are going to die because I'm not doing it. Sarah. Webb's voice stopped her at the edge of the overlook. One of the hostages is a 10-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez. She's there with her class, probably scared out of her mind, wondering if she's ever going to see her parents again. Sarah stopped walking but didn't turn around. The terrorist holding her has already killed one hostage to show he's serious. A security guard named Tom Mitchell, father of 3, who was just doing his job when these animals decided to make their statement. Don't. Emma Rodriguez is 10 years old. She likes horses and wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up. Right now she's sitting in a federal building with a gun pointed at her head, waiting for someone to save her. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. You're manipulating me. Yes, I am. Because 17 innocent people are going to die if you don't do what you do best. What I do best is kill people. That's not who I want to be anymore, but it's who you are. Webb moved closer, his voice gentle but insistent. You can serve coffee and pretend you're just another civilian, but last night proved you can't. Turn off what you really are. When those men threatened you, you didn't react like a waitress. You reacted like an operator. Sarah finally turned around, facing Webb across the overlook. If I do this, it's the last time. After Columbus, you leave me alone. You let me disappear for real. Agreed. And if I don't do this, then tomorrow morning, the FBI gets an anonymous tip about a former military operative living under false identity in Millfield, Ohio. They'll investigate. They'll discover inconsistencies in your background, and your quiet life becomes very complicated very quickly. Sarah studied his face, looking for any sign that he was bluffing. She found none. Marcus Webb had always been ruthless when it came to getting what he needed for a mission, and this was just another operation to him. You bastard, yes I am. But I'm a bastard who's trying to save 17 innocent lives. Sarah walked back to the railing, looking down at Millfield where people were beginning their normal Tuesday routines. Mrs. Patterson watering her flowers. The morning shift arriving at Murphy's Diner to prepare for the breakfast crowd. Danny Price probably still asleep after his late night of witnessing something that had changed the trajectory of several lives. What's the timeline? Hostages were taken at 0800 this morning. Terrorists have given us until 1800 to meet their demands, which we obviously can't do. We need to move before they start executing people to show they're serious. Sarah checked her watch. 8:15 a.m., less than 10 hours to plan and execute a precision shot that would determine whether 17 people went home to their families or became statistics in another terrorist attack. I'll need to see the building layout, wind conditions, equipment specifications, already prepared. Webb pulled a folder from inside his jacket. Everything you need is here. Sarah took the folder without opening it. Transportation? Helicopter standing by at the county airfield. 20-minute flight to Columbus. You were pretty confident I'd agree. I know you, Sarah, you can. Pretend you don't care about saving lives, but we both know that's not true. It's why you were the best operator we ever had. Sarah opened the folder, scanning the building schematics and tactical overview. The target building was a federal courthouse in downtown Columbus, a stone and glass structure with limited access points and clear sight lines from several surrounding buildings. The terrorists had chosen their location well, positioning themselves where conventional assault would be nearly impossible without significant collateral damage. But there was a clear line of sight from an office building across the street, 12 stories up, through a window that would provide the angle needed for a single decisive shot. Who's the target? Cell leader. Goes by the name Hassan al-Mahmoud. Though that's probably an alias. He's the one holding the gun on the hostages. Take him out, and the others will likely surrender or be overwhelmed by the tactical teams. Sarah studied the photograph of her target. Middle-aged, bearded, wearing what looked like a suicide vest that could detonate if he was wounded rather. Then killed instantly. The shot would have to be perfect, a headshot that would cause immediate brain death, and prevent any involuntary muscle contractions. What about extraction? Clean exit through the building's service elevator, helicopter. Pickup from the roof of the adjacent parking garage. You'll be back in Millfield before the evening news reports on the resolution of the hostage situation. It was a clean plan, professionally conceived and meticulously planned. The kind of operation Webb specialized in, where a single operator could accomplish what an entire assault team couldn't do without unacceptable risk. I'll need my rifle. Already secured and transported to the shooting position. Sarah closed the folder, handing it back to Webb. For a moment, she looked like she was going to refuse, to walk away and accept whatever consequences her refusal might bring. Then she thought about Emma Rodriguez, 10 years old and wanting to be a veterinarian, sitting in a federal building with a gun pointed at her head. "Let's go save some lives," she said. The helicopter touched down on the roof of the Meridian office building at 2:47 p.m., its rotors whipping the October air into a frenzy that scattered leaves and debris across the concrete surface. Sarah stepped out with the fluid motion of someone who'd made this transition from aircraft to operational zone dozens of times before, her borrowed tactical gear fitting like a second skin she'd forgotten she owned. The building had been evacuated and secured by federal agents, leaving only essential personnel and Sarah's support team on the upper floors. She moved through the corridors with purpose, muscle memory guiding her toward the designated shooting position, while her mind processed the final mission parameters. The office on the 12th floor had been transformed into a precision shooting platform. Windows had been removed to eliminate glass refraction. Environmental monitoring equipment tracked wind speed and direction, and her rifle waited on its bipod like an old friend she'd hoped never to see again. It was a custom-built weapon, manufactured to her exact specifications 3 years ago and maintained in perfect condition despite her absence from active duty. The Accuracy International AW50 had been her constant companion through 37 confirmed kills across 4 deployments, each shot calculated and deliberate, each target eliminated to prevent greater harm to innocent lives. Sarah approached the rifle with reverence, running her hands along the familiar contours of the stock and barrel. The weapon represented everything she'd tried to leave behind: the weight of responsibility, the burden of perfect precision, the knowledge that other people's lives depended on her ability to end someone else's life with mathematical certainty. "Range is confirmed at 1,230 meters, said Agent Rebecca Santos, the FBI's tactical coordinator for the operation. She was younger than Sarah, probably in her early 30s, with the intense focus of someone who'd worked her way up through federal law enforcement without making the kind of mistakes that ended careers. Sarah settled behind the rifle, adjusting the bipod and checking the scope's alignment with practiced efficiency. Through the magnified optics, the federal courthouse across the street appeared close enough to reach out and touch. She could see the windows where the hostages were being held, the tactical teams positioned at various access points, and the lone figure who represented both the threat and her target. Hassan al-Manhoud stood near the courthouse's main lobby, clearly visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows that had been designed to make the building feel open and welcoming to the public. He held an assault rifle in one hand and what appeared to be a detonator in the other, his position carefully chosen to maximize his control over both the hostages and the situation. "Target is confirmed," Sarah said, her voice falling into the calm, professional tone she'd used during dozens of similar briefings. Male, approximately 6 feet tall, dark hair, wearing tactical vest with visible explosive components. Distance: 1,230 meters. Elevation angle -4 degrees. Through her scope, she could see the hostages clustered in the lobby's seating area. 17 people ranging in age from 10 to 65, their faces showing the kind of terror that comes from understanding that your life hangs in the balance of decisions being made by people who view you as expendable. Emma Rodriguez sat in the front row of the hostage group, a small girl with dark hair pulled back in pigtails, wearing a bright red jacket that made her easy to identify even at this distance. She wasn't crying, which impressed Sarah more than she cared to admit. The girl was scared but trying to be brave, probably thinking about her parents and whether she'd ever see them again. Wind speed is 3 to 5 miles per hour, variable direction, Agent Santos reported, reading from her monitoring equipment. Temperature is 62 degrees, humidity 43%, barometric pressure steady. Sarah absorbed the environmental data, making automatic calculations that accounted for bullet trajectory, wind drift, and the dozens of other factors. That could mean the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic failure. At 1,200 meters, even a slight miscalculation could result in a wounded target instead of a clean kill, which would almost certainly trigger the explosive vest and kill every hostage in the lobby. "How much time do we have?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from her mission briefing. "Terrorists' deadline is 1,800 hours. That gives us just over 3 hours, but intelligence suggests they may start executing hostages sooner if they sense we're planning an assault." Through her scope, Sarah watched Hassan pace back and forth near the windows, occasionally gesturing with his rifle toward the hostages. He was agitated, which made him unpredictable but also potentially careless. Agitated people made mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities. She settled into the familiar rhythm of precision shooting, controlled breathing, heart rate management, and the kind of focused calm that allowed her to separate the mechanical act of pulling a trigger from the human reality of ending someone's life. It was a skill that had taken years to master and one she'd hoped never to use again. "Target is moving in a predictable pattern," she reported. "Approximately 15 seconds between positions, with a 3-second pause at the northwest window." "That's our shot window." Agent Santos nodded, speaking quietly into her radio to coordinate with the tactical teams positioned around the courthouse. When the shot was fired, they would have seconds to breach the building and secure the remaining terrorists before they could harm the hostages or detonate any secondary explosives. Sarah tracked her target through 2 complete cycles, timing his movements and noting his behavioral patterns. Hassan was disciplined but not professionally trained, which meant he was dangerous but predictable. He favored his right side, kept his weapon at a consistent angle, and paused at the same position, near the window with mechanical regularity. "I'm ready," she announced. "All teams in position," Agent Santos confirmed. "You have green light to engage on your discretion." The words hung in the air like a prayer or a curse, depending on your perspective. Sarah had heard similar authorizations 37 times before, and each one had resulted in someone's death and someone else's salvation. The mathematics were always the same: one life taken to save many others. Precision applied to chaos, order imposed through violence. She tracked Hassan through another cycle, watching him move from the center of the lobby toward the northwest window where he would pause to survey the street below. Her breathing slowed, her heart rate dropped, and the familiar tunnel vision of perfect focus narrowed her world to a single point of intersection between her crosshairs and her target's head. Hassan reached his position at the window and paused, exactly as he had done a dozen times before. Sarah's finger found the trigger, applying pressure with the gradual control that separated professional shooters from amateurs. The rifle would fire when it was ready, when her body was perfectly still and her mind was perfectly calm. The shot broke like crystal, a single moment of controlled violence that sent a .50 caliber round across 1,200 meters of urban landscape with mathematical precision. Through her scope, Sarah watched Hassan's head snap back and his body collapse, the rifle falling from his hands and the detonator spinning away across the lobby floor. "Target down," she reported, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The tactical teams moved immediately, breaching the courthouse through multiple entry points with the coordinated efficiency of professionals who'd trained for exactly this scenario. The remaining terrorists, suddenly leaderless and facing overwhelming force, surrendered within minutes without firing another shot. Sarah watched through her scope as the hostages were evacuated, each person escorted to safety by federal agents, who treated them with the careful attention reserved for trauma victims. Emma Rodriguez emerged near the end of the group, still wearing her bright red jacket, now being carried by a female agent who spoke to her in soothing tones. "All hostages secure," Agent Santos announced. "Mission accomplished." Sarah stepped back from her rifle, the familiar weight of completion settling over her like a shroud. Another target eliminated, another mission successful, another group of innocent people who would go home to their families, because she'd been willing to do what needed to be done. But this time felt different. This time she'd been forced back into a world she'd tried to leave behind, compelled to use skills she'd hoped to forget. The satisfaction of a successful mission was tempered by the knowledge that her carefully constructed civilian life had been shattered in the process. "Outstanding work," Agent Santos said, clearly impressed by the precision of the shot and the flawless execution of the operation. "That was some of the finest long-range shooting I've ever witnessed." Sarah nodded politely but didn't respond. She'd heard similar praise before, and it never made the weight of taking a life any easier to bear. Hassan al-Mahmoud was dead because she'd killed him, and while his death had saved 17 innocent lives, it had also cost her the peace she'd been trying to build in Millfield. The extraction proceeded exactly as Webb had promised. Sarah was escorted to the building's roof, where the helicopter waited to transport her back to the county airfield near her adopted hometown. By 4:30 p.m., she was back in civilian clothes, driving her rust-spotted Honda through the familiar streets of a place that no longer felt like home. The news broke while she was still driving. Radio reports described a successful federal operation that had ended a hostage situation in Columbus, with all 17 hostages rescued and 4 terrorists either killed or captured. The reports mentioned the precision shooting that had eliminated the terrorist leader, but they attributed it to an unnamed federal sniper rather than a former Special Forces operator who now served coffee at Murphy's Diner. Sarah parked outside her apartment and climbed the stairs to her small living space, where the mundane details of her civilian life waited like artifacts from another person's existence. The coffee maker she'd bought at the local hardware store. The television she'd purchased to fill the silence of evenings when the weight of her past made sleep impossible. The photographs she'd taken of local landmarks, trying to convince herself she belonged in this place among these people. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Webb. "Exceptional work. As agreed, this concludes our business. Your service record will reflect an honorable discharge with full benefits eligibility. Thank you for your sacrifice." It was over. Her debt was paid, her obligation fulfilled, and her past officially closed. Sarah Chen, former staff sergeant and precision marksman, was free to resume her life as Sarah Chen, waitress and small-town nobody. But freedom felt different than she'd expected. Instead of relief, she felt hollow, like someone who'd given away a piece of themselves they couldn't get back. The rifle had felt natural in her hands, the calculations had come automatically, and the satisfaction of a perfect shot had reminded her why she'd been so good at her job. She tried to return to her normal routine. She showed up for her shift at Murphy's Diner at 11 p.m., tied on her apron, and began serving coffee to the familiar collection of late-night customers. Jim Morrison was there with his usual pie and endless stories about life on the road. Margaret Walsh stopped by during her break from the hospital, catching up on small-town gossip while grading her daughter's homework. But everything felt different. Now, the customers seemed smaller somehow, their problems more trivial, their lives constrained by boundaries that felt suffocating after the clarity of life and death decisions. Sarah found herself watching the door, cataloging threats that didn't exist, maintaining awareness levels that were completely unnecessary for serving coffee in a peaceful town. Danny Price arrived around midnight, ordering his usual black coffee and wheat toast while working on his laptop. He'd been different since the night of the confrontation, more attentive to Sarah's movements, more curious about her background. Tonight, he looked up from his writing with an expression of recognition that made her uncomfortable. That was some story today, he said, his voice carefully casual, about the hostage situation in Columbus. Sarah refilled his coffee cup with steady hands. Terrible thing. Glad everyone made it out safely. The news said it was resolved by a single sniper shot from over 1,200 meters. Pretty impressive shooting. I wouldn't know anything about that. Danny nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on her face with the intensity of someone who made his living by reading people and asking the right questions. Must have been someone with serious military training. The kind of precision that takes years to develop. Sarah moved away from his table without responding, but she could feel his attention following her as she continued her rounds. Danny Price was a writer, which meant he was observant and curious and persistent when something caught his interest. The confrontation with Rick and his friends had already made her memorable. She didn't need additional scrutiny from someone whose job involved uncovering stories other people preferred to keep buried. The rest of her shift passed without incident, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. She'd been forced to reveal her true nature once to Webb, and now that knowledge existed in the world like a seed that could sprout into complications she couldn't control. When her shift ended at 7 a.m., she walked out to find Danny Price waiting by her car. He looked tired but determined, holding a cup of coffee from the convenience store across the street. "We need to talk," he said. "No, we don't. I know who you are." Sarah stopped with her hand on the car door handle. "You know I'm a waitress." "I know you're a waitress now. But I also know that yesterday afternoon, a federal sniper took out a terrorist leader from 1,200 meters using skills that match exactly what I saw you do to those 3 guys the other night." Sarah turned to face him, studying his expression for signs of threat or opportunity. Danny Price was young, maybe early 30s, with the kind of earnest intensity that suggested he genuinely believed in the importance of truth and transparency. "That's an interesting theory," she said. "It's not a theory. I've been researching military snipers since our little incident, and the timing is too perfect to be coincidental. Female operator, exceptional precision shooting skills, suddenly appears in a small town 6 months ago with a background that's solid, but somehow feels too clean." Sarah got into her car without responding, but Danny leaned down to speak through the open window. "I'm not trying to expose you," he said. "I'm trying to understand why someone with your capabilities is hiding in a place like this. Maybe because I want to be left alone. Maybe. Or maybe because you're running from something that won't stay buried forever." Sarah started her car, but Danny's next words made her pause with her hand on the gear shift. "Those 17 people in Columbus are alive because of what you did yesterday. That little girl, Emma Rodriguez, gets to grow up and become a veterinarian. Because you were willing to take a shot that nobody else could make." Sarah looked up at him through the car window. "How do you know about Emma wanting to be a veterinarian?" "Because I called her mother this morning. Because I wanted to understand what it meant to save someone's life from 1,200 meters away." "And what did you learn?" Danny smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, it looked completely genuine. "I learned that heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like. And I learned that sometimes the most important stories are about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when nobody's watching." Sarah drove home without responding, but Danny's words followed her up the stairs to her apartment. She'd spent 6 months trying to become ordinary, to blend into the background of other people's lives, to be forgettable and unremarkable and safe. But yesterday had proven that she couldn't escape who she really was. When innocent lives were at stake, when precision mattered more than politics, when 17 people needed someone willing to make an impossible shot, she'd stepped up and done what needed to be done. The question now was what came next. She could try to disappear again, find another small town and another anonymous job, continue running from a past that would always be part of who she was. Or she could accept that some people were meant for more than serving coffee and pretending. Their skills didn't matter. 3 days later, Sarah Chen received a phone call from Director Patricia Hawkins of the FBI's Crisis Response Team. The director had heard about her work in Columbus through unofficial channels and wanted to discuss opportunities for someone with her unique skill set. "We're looking for consultants," Director Hawkins explained during their conversation. "People with specialized capabilities who can be called upon when conventional law enforcement isn't sufficient. The pay is excellent, the work is meaningful, and you'd maintain your civilian status while serving your country in a different capacity." Sarah listened to the offer while standing in her apartment, looking down at Main Street where normal people were conducting their normal lives. Mrs. Patterson was arranging her autumn displays. Jim Morrison was probably sleeping off his night shift, and Margaret Walsh was likely getting ready for another day at the hospital. "I'd need to maintain my current life," Sarah said finally. "Keep my job at the diner, keep my apartment, stay connected to this community. Of course, we're not looking for full-time operators. We're looking for people who can respond when their specific skills are needed, then return to their normal lives until the next crisis requires their expertise." It wasn't the quiet retirement Sarah had envisioned when she'd first arrived in Millfield. But it also wasn't the endless cycle of military deployments and classified operations she'd left behind. It was something new, a way to use her skills without losing herself in the process. "I'll consider it," she said. 2 weeks later, Sarah Chen reported for her shift at Murphy's Diner wearing her familiar black pants, white shirt, and green apron. She served coffee to truckers and late-night customers, wiped down tables, and counted the till at closing time with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. But now there was a difference. Hidden in her apartment was a secure phone that connected her to Director Hawkins and a new kind of mission. Stored at the county airfield was equipment that might be needed if another situation arose that required her particular expertise. And in her mind was the knowledge that 17 people were alive, because she'd been willing to step out of her peaceful anonymity when it mattered most. Danny Price still came in 3 nights a week, still ordered black coffee and wheat toast, still worked on his laptop while observing the late-night rhythms of Murphy's Diner. But now when he looked at Sarah, there was respect in his expression rather than curiosity. He'd kept her secret, understanding instinctively that some stories were too important to tell publicly. "Quiet night," he said during one of his visits, looking up from his writing as Sarah refilled his coffee. "The best kind," she replied. "You ever think about the people you've helped? Wonder what they're doing now?" Sarah considered the question while wiping down the counter. "Sometimes. But I try to focus on the people who are right here, right now." Danny nodded. Emma Rodriguez started taking writing lessons. Her mother said she's still planning to be a veterinarian, but now she wants to specialize in horses. "That's good. She should follow her dreams. Her mother wanted me to give you a message if I ever saw you again." Sarah looked up from her cleaning. "What message?" "Thank you." 2 words that carried the weight of 17 saved lives, the gratitude of families who would never know the name of the woman who'd brought their loved ones home safely. Sarah nodded, accepting the thanks on behalf of everyone who'd ever taken a difficult shot in service of people they'd never meet. Outside Murphy's Diner, Millfield continued its quiet existence. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that their town was home to someone who could reach out across impossible distances and touch the lives of strangers with mathematical precision. It was exactly the kind of anonymity Sarah had sought when she'd first arrived, the peace of being nobody. Special in a place where nobody asked difficult questions. But now she understood that being nobody special didn't mean her skills didn't matter. It meant she could choose when and how to use them, could maintain the balance between the person she'd been and the person she wanted to become. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Possible situation developing in Detroit. Stand by for briefing. Sarah glanced at the message, then deleted it and returned to her work. Whatever was happening in Detroit would either resolve itself or escalate to the point where her involvement became necessary. Until then, she had coffee to serve and customers to take care of, a small-town life to maintain and protect. Because sometimes the most important work happened not in the headlines or history books, but in the quiet moments between crises, when ordinary people did extraordinary things and then returned to their ordinary lives as if nothing had changed. Emma Rodriguez would grow up to become a veterinarian who specialized in horses, never knowing that her dreams were possible because a waitress in Ohio had been willing to make an impossible shot. And Sarah Chen would continue serving coffee and living quietly in Millfield, always ready to step out of the shadows when innocent lives hung in the balance, then disappear back into anonymity when the crisis passed. It wasn't the retirement she'd planned, but it was the life she'd earned. And for the first time since leaving the military, it felt like enough. 6 months had passed since the Columbus incident, and Sarah Chen had settled into a rhythm that balanced her two worlds with careful precision. By day, she remained the unassuming waitress at Murphy's Diner, serving coffee and taking orders with the same quiet efficiency that had made her forgettable to most customers. By night, when her secure phone buzzed with encrypted messages, she became something else entirely. The calls had come 3 times since Columbus. A kidnapping in Pittsburgh, where her reconnaissance skills had helped locate the victim. A standoff in Cleveland, where her tactical assessment had prevented a bloodbath. A terrorist threat in Cincinnati, where her mere presence as backup had given negotiators the confidence to resolve the situation peacefully. Each mission reinforced her value to Director Hawkins' crisis response team, and each successful resolution strengthened her belief that she'd found the right balance between service and anonymity. It was a Tuesday evening in April when everything changed again. Sarah was working her usual shift, moving between tables with practiced ease, when the bell above the door chimed to announce a new customer. She looked up from pouring coffee to see a woman in her 30s, well-dressed but nervous, clutching a manila folder and scanning the diner with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was looking for someone specific. The woman's eyes found Sarah's and held them for a moment before she approached the counter. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "Are you Sarah Chen?" Sarah's training kicked in automatically, cataloging potential threats and escape routes while maintaining her neutral expression. Very few people knew her real name, and those who did were either federal agents or former military personnel with legitimate reasons for the knowledge. "I'm Sarah," she said carefully. "Can I help you with something?" "My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez. I work for Doctors Without Borders, and I need to speak with you about something urgent." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but the organization commanded respect. Doctors Without Borders operated in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, providing medical care to people who had nowhere else to turn. If one of their representatives was looking for her specifically, it probably meant trouble. "I'm just a waitress," Sarah said. "I think you might have me confused with someone else." Dr. Vasquez opened her folder and pulled out a photograph. That made Sarah's blood run cold. It was a picture of her in military fatigues, taken during her second deployment to Afghanistan. She was kneeling beside her rifle, squinting against the desert sun, looking every inch the professional operator she'd once been. This photograph was taken 3 years ago at Forward Operating Base Chapman, Dr. Vasquez said quietly. "You were part of a protection detail for a medical convoy that delivered supplies to a village called Karwar. Do you remember? Sarah remembered. It had been one of her last missions before leaving the military, a routine escort duty that had turned complicated when insurgents had attempted to ambush the convoy. She'd provided overwatch from a ridgeline, protecting the medical team while they delivered vaccines and antibiotics to villagers who desperately needed both. I remember the mission, Sarah said. What does that have to do with anything? Dr. Vasquez reached into her folder again, this time pulling out a letter written in careful English on lined paper. This was sent to our headquarters in Geneva 2 weeks ago. It's from a village elder in Karwar, asking for our help in locating the American sniper who saved their medical convoy. Sarah took the letter, scanning the handwritten words that described her actions during that long-ago mission. The village elder had witnessed her shots from the ridgeline, had seen her eliminate 3 insurgents who were preparing to attack the medical team with rocket-propelled grenades. His letter was respectful but urgent, requesting help in finding the soldier who had protected their children's medicine. Why are they looking for me? Because they need you again. Dr. Vasquez pulled out a larger photograph, this one showing a village that had been partially destroyed by bombing. Karwar was attacked 6 weeks ago by a Taliban splinter group that's been targeting medical facilities throughout the region. They killed 12 villagers, including 2 of our local medical staff, and destroyed the clinic we'd helped establish. Sarah studied the photograph, recognizing landmarks from her memory of the village. The school where children had gathered to receive vaccines. The well where women had drawn water while their husbands worked in the fields. The small market where vendors had sold everything from spices to hand-woven textiles. All of it damaged or destroyed by people who viewed medical care as a threat to their ideology. The survivors have requested specifically that you return to help them rebuild, Dr. Vasquez continued. They remember what you did for them before, and they trust you in a way they don't trust other outsiders. Sarah set down the letter and photograph, shaking her head. I'm not in the military anymore. I can't just go to Afghanistan and start shooting people. We're not asking you to shoot anyone. We're asking you to provide security for a medical team that's going back to Karwar to rebuild the clinic and treat the wounded. Your presence alone would be enough to deter most attacks, and your tactical knowledge would help us plan routes and procedures that minimize risk to our staff. It was a compelling offer, the kind of mission that combined Sarah's skills with her desire to help innocent people. But it was also exactly the kind of overseas commitment she'd left the military to avoid. She'd built a life in Millfield precisely because it was safe and predictable and thousands of miles away from places where people killed each other over access to medical care. I can't leave my job here, Sarah said. I have responsibilities. The mission would last 6 weeks. We'd pay you a consultant fee that would more than cover any lost wages, and we'd arrange for your absence from work to appear completely legitimate. Sarah looked around the diner, taking in the familiar sights and sounds of her adopted home. Jim Morrison at the counter with his eternal pie. Margaret Walsh grading homework during her break from the hospital. Danny Price working on his laptop while nursing his 3rd cup of coffee. Normal people living normal lives in a place where the most dangerous thing that happened was the occasional drunk customer getting rowdy. I need time to think about it, she said. Dr. Vasquez nodded, gathering her papers and photographs back into the folder. I understand, but please don't take too long. Every day we delay is another day those people go without proper medical care. She left her business card on the counter and walked out into the April evening, leaving Sarah alone with a decision that could reshape her carefully constructed life once again. The next morning, Sarah called Director Hawkins to discuss the offer. They met at the same state park overlook where she'd first encountered Colonel Webb, the familiar location providing privacy for a conversation that couldn't be overheard by curious civilians. It's a legitimate organization with a solid reputation. Director Hawkins confirmed after reviewing Dr. Vasquez's credentials. Doctors Without Borders has been operating in Afghanistan for decades, and their security protocols are generally excellent. What's your assessment of the risk level? Higher than your domestic assignments, obviously, but probably lower than your military deployments. The Taliban splinter group that attacked Karwar is relatively small and poorly equipped. Your reputation alone would likely be enough to keep them at a distance. Sarah walked to the overlook railing, looking down at Millfield where her alternate life waited with its comfortable routines and predictable challenges. 6 months ago, she would have refused the Afghanistan mission without hesitation. But the domestic crisis response work had reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten: the satisfaction that came from using her skills to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. What would happen to my consultant status if I take this assignment? Nothing. If anything, it would enhance your value to the team. International experience with humanitarian organizations would make you more versatile for future missions. Director Hawkins joined her at the railing, studying Sarah's expression with the kind of professional attention that suggested she already knew which decision was being made. "There's something else you should know," the director said. "We've been monitoring communications related to the Karwar attack. The Taliban group responsible has been bragging about their success and threatening to target other medical facilities in the region. Your presence might prevent attacks on multiple villages, not just the one requesting your help." It was the kind of strategic consideration that appealed to Sarah's tactical mind. One mission that could protect dozens of innocent people, prevent future attacks, and allow medical workers to continue their life-saving efforts without constant fear of violence. "When would I need to leave?" "Next week. The medical team is already assembled and ready to deploy, but they're waiting for security arrangements to be finalized." Sarah made her decision with the same calm calculation she brought to everything else. The mission made sense tactically, strategically, and morally. The risk was manageable, the potential impact was significant, and the people requesting her help had earned her respect years ago when she'd first witnessed their courage under fire. "I'll do it." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and arrangements. Sarah requested a leave of absence from Murphy's Diner, citing a family emergency that required extended travel. Her manager was understanding, promising to hold her position until she returned. The regular customers accepted her explanation without question, wishing her well and asking her to stay in touch. Danny Price was the exception. He approached her during what he knew would be her last shift, ordering his usual coffee and toast, but clearly having something more important on his mind. "Family emergency, huh?" he said, studying her face with the journalist's instinct for detecting hidden stories. "Sometimes family requires traveling further than you'd prefer," Sarah replied, which was technically true if you considered the villages of Karwar to be an extended family of sorts. "Just promise me you'll be careful out there and come back when you're done with whatever you're really doing." Sarah poured his coffee with steady hands. "I always come back." The flight to Afghanistan was long and complicated, involving multiple connections and security briefings that reminded Sarah why she'd been happy to leave the world of international operations. But when she finally arrived at the temporary base camp near Karwar, the familiar weight of tactical gear and the sight of her rifle case made her feel more centered than she had in months. The medical team was impressive: 3 doctors, 2 nurses, a logistics coordinator, and a translator, all of whom had volunteered for an assignment that carried significant personal risk. Dr. Vasquez led the group with quiet competence, treating Sarah's arrival as the final piece of a puzzle that could now be completed safely. "The village elder wants to meet with you before we begin operations," Dr. Vasquez explained during their first briefing. "He's been asking about you specifically since we confirmed your participation." The meeting took place in what remained of the village school, a concrete building that had survived the attack, but bore scars from shrapnel and small arms fire. The village elder was a man named Hafez Ahmed, probably in his 60s, with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much violence but still held hope for better days. "You have returned," he said in accented but clear English. "Allah be praised." "I'm honored to be here," Sarah replied, meaning it more than she'd expected to. 3 years ago, you protected medicine for our children. Today, you protect the doctors who will heal our wounded. This is the work of a guardian angel. Sarah didn't feel like a guardian angel. She felt like a soldier doing her job, using skills she'd learned through necessity to protect people who deserved better than the violence that had been visited upon them. But she accepted the elder's gratitude with the respect it deserved, understanding that her actions carried meaning beyond their tactical implications. The mission proceeded with textbook efficiency. Sarah established overwatch positions that covered all approaches to the village, coordinated with local security forces to establish patrol patterns, and maintained constant surveillance for potential threats. Her reputation preceded her arrival, and word of her presence spread quickly through the network of insurgent communications that intelligence agencies monitored. The Taliban splinter group that had attacked Kawar never materialized. For a second assault, whether they were deterred by Sarah's reputation, distracted by other targets, or simply lacked the resources for sustained operations, their absence allowed the medical team to work without interference. The clinic was rebuilt, the wounded were treated, and the villagers began the slow process of healing from both physical and psychological trauma. Sarah found herself working more closely with the local population than she had during her military deployments. Instead of maintaining tactical distance, she helped distribute supplies, assisted with security training for village defenders, and even participated in the ceremony that reopened the rebuilt clinic. "You are different now," Hafez Ahmed observed during one of their conversations. 3 years ago, you were a warrior. Today, you are a protector." Sarah considered this distinction while cleaning her rifle in the evening quiet of the temporary camp. The difference wasn't in her skills or equipment, but in her motivation and perspective. As a soldier, she'd followed orders and completed missions for abstract strategic purposes. As a consultant and protector, she chose her fights based on personal conviction and moral clarity. The 6 weeks passed quickly, marked by successful medical operations, improved village security, and the gradual restoration of normal life to a community that had been traumatized by senseless violence. When it came time to leave, Sarah felt the same mixture of satisfaction and reluctance that had characterized her best military missions. "Will you return if we need you again?" Hafez Ahmed asked during their farewell ceremony. "If I can," Sarah promised. "But I hope you won't need me to." The flight back to Ohio gave her time to process the experience and its implications for her future. The Afghanistan mission had been different from her domestic crisis response work, more complex and meaningful in ways that surprised her. She'd helped rebuild something that had been destroyed, protected people who needed protection, and used her skills in service of healing rather than destruction. When she walked back into Murphy's diner 3 days later, tying on her apron and resuming her role as the quiet night shift waitress, everything looked the same but felt different. The familiar routine of serving coffee and taking orders was comforting, but it no longer felt like the complete definition of her identity. Danny Price was waiting for her, of course, sitting at his usual table with his laptop and coffee. He looked up when she approached, studying her face with the careful attention he brought to analyzing sources and stories. "You look different," he said, relaxed, "like you figured something out while you were dealing with that family emergency." "Maybe I did." "Want to talk about it?" Sarah poured his coffee, considering how much truth she could safely share. Sometimes helping family means accepting that you're not as different from who you used to be as you thought you were. Danny nodded, understanding more than his questions revealed. And sometimes accepting who you are is the first step to becoming who you're supposed to be. Over the following months, Sarah's life settled into a new pattern that incorporated all aspects of her identity. She continued working at Murphy's Diner, maintaining her connections to the community that had become her anchor. She responded to domestic crisis calls from Director Hawkins, using her skills to resolve situations that required precision and tactical expertise. And she accepted 2 more international humanitarian missions, providing security for medical teams in Somalia and Syria. Each mission reinforced her understanding that she'd found her calling not in pure civilian life or full-time military service, but in the space between them where her skills could be applied selectively to problems that mattered. She was no longer running from her past or trying to eliminate her military identity, but integrating all parts of herself into a life that felt authentic and purposeful. The transformation wasn't lost on the people around her. The regular customers at Murphy's Diner began to notice a subtle confidence in her movements, a deeper sense of purpose in her interactions. She was still the same quiet, efficient waitress they'd grown to appreciate, but there was something more substantial beneath the surface. Margaret Walsh was the first to comment on the change. "You seem happier," she observed during one of her late-night breaks from the hospital. "More settled." "Somehow, I think I've figured out how to balance some things that used to feel contradictory," Sarah replied. "That's a good place to be. Most people spend their whole lives trying to figure out that balance." 6 months after returning from Afghanistan, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of the rebuilt clinic in Karwar, showing children receiving vaccinations while their mothers watched with expressions of hope and gratitude. Attached was a note from Hafez Ahmed: "The guardian angel's work continues. The children are healthy, the village is safe, and we remember your kindness always." Sarah placed the photograph on her apartment wall next to images from Millfield and mementos from her domestic missions. They represented different aspects of the same truth, that protection and service could take many forms, that heroism didn't always require headlines or recognition, and that the most important work often happened in the spaces between dramatic events. Her secure phone buzzed with a message from Director Hawkins: "Possible situation developing in Denver. Medical facility threatened by domestic extremists. Are you available?" Sarah read the message while standing in her small kitchen, coffee cup in hand, looking out at the quiet streets of Millfield. Normal people were beginning their normal days, unaware that their town was home to someone who could reach across distances, both geographical and personal, to touch lives in ways they'd never know. She typed her response, en route in 2 hours. It was who she was now. Not a waitress pretending to be ordinary, not a soldier hiding from her past, but someone who'd learned to integrate all parts of herself into a life that served others, while remaining true to her own needs for peace and purpose. She could serve coffee and save lives, live quietly and act decisively, be nobody special and someone essential depending on what the situation required. Sarah Chen finished her coffee, gathered her gear, and prepared for another mission. Somewhere in Denver, innocent people needed protection from those who would harm them. In Millfield, customers would find a note explaining that she'd been called away on family business, but would return soon. In Afghanistan, children would continue to receive medical care because she'd helped rebuild the infrastructure that made it possible. It was exactly the life she'd never planned but always needed. And for the first time since leaving the military, it felt like home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.